I am going to tell you about a wolf, and a woman, and 5 summers, and the considerable embarrassment of being the most powerful alpha in the Veldrath territory, and being the last one in the room to understand what was happening. Gray understood from the first afternoon. Gray is my wolf, not a separate creature, not a spirit animal I consult at a distance, but the wolf nature that lives in me the way the hearth lives in a stone hall, always present, central to everything, the thing that makes the whole structure warm. For 11 years he has been mine and I have been his, and in 11 years I have never once known him to leave my side for anyone else. Until the first summer Lyra came to read. She arrived in the second week of the flowering season, when the wildflowers had come in across the lake meadow, and the hold of Veldrath smelled of clover and warm stone. She came with a pack on her back and 2 large leather satchels of books, and she introduced herself to my steward, Karen, with the particular efficiency of someone who has done this introduction many times and has it down to its essential information. Her name, her role, her schedule, and the note that she preferred to work in whatever room had the best light. I was in my study when she arrived. I heard her voice in the corridor, not the words, just the quality of it, the unhurried warmth of it, and my wolf lifted his head from where he had been lying at the foot of my chair and turned toward the door. I noted this. I did not think about it. The first reading session was that afternoon, in the long hall with the tall windows that looked out over the lake. She had arranged 3 rows of chairs for the pack members who came, the elderly mostly, and the children who couldn't yet read for themselves, and a handful of adults who simply liked to hear a story told well. My head cook was there, 2 of my garrison captains, the hold's resident midwife, who sat in the back row and knitted without looking at her hands. I was not there. I had administrative work that needed attending to. Gray, however. Gray walked out of my study, down the corridor, into the long hall, and lay down at the feet of the reading chair before Lyra had even opened her first book. I heard about this from Karen at dinner, delivered with the particular diplomatic neutrality Karen used for information he found interesting but did not wish to editorialize about. "Your wolf," he said, "attended the reading session this afternoon." I looked at him. "He did not leave until she closed the last book," Karen added. "He slept through most of it." "Gray doesn't sleep in company," I said. "He did today," Karen said, and passed me the salt with the expression of a man who has said what he wanted to say and considers the matter delivered. I thought about this for a day. Then I attended the second reading session. I sat in the back row. Not obviously, I was the Alpha King of Veldrath, not a suspicious man lurking at the edge of a reading circle, and there is a difference, though I will admit the distinction was perhaps not as clear as I might have wished. I sat in the back and I watched. Lyra read. She read the way some people speak, without apparent effort, without performance, as if the words were simply the natural extension of her breath. She was reading an old border war chronicle that the pack's eldest wolves remembered from their grandparents' time, and she made it sound like something that had happened recently, to people you knew. The children sat without fidgeting, which I had never seen children do for more than 4 minutes together. The garrison captains were leaning forward in their chairs. The midwife had stopped knitting. Gray lay at her feet and slept. Not the alert doze he kept beside my chair, one ear up, ready to move. Full sleep, deep and steady, the sleep of a creature entirely at ease. I watched this for 3 sessions before I permitted myself to form a thought about it. The thought, when it arrived, was, "My wolf likes her voice." This seemed insufficient as an explanation, but it was all I had, and I was not ready to look for a better one. On the 4th day she looked up from the book directly at me, not the careful, peripheral awareness of a pack member acknowledging their alpha in the room, direct, level, the way you look at someone you have noticed and are deciding what to make of. She said nothing. I said nothing. She looked back at her book and read the next sentence. Gray opened one eye, looked at me and closed it again. I went back to my study and told myself I had administrative work. That was the first summer. Lyra came back the second summer, and the third, and the fourth. She came in the second week of the flowering season each time, with her pack and her 2 leather satchels, and the introduction she had down to its essential information. Each summer she read for 10 days. Each summer Gray abandoned my chair the moment she arrived, and did not return to it until the day she left. Each summer I told myself a version of the same insufficient explanation. My wolf likes her voice. The second summer, I attended every session. I told myself this was reasonable. An alpha king should know what the pack is hearing, what stories are being told, what version of the old histories is being presented. This was administrative attention, not personal interest. Gray, if he had opinions about this reasoning, expressed them by sleeping more deeply whenever I was in the room and Lyra was reading, as if my presence confirmed something he had been waiting to confirm. By the third summer, the pack had entirely accepted that the Alpha King would sit in the back row for the reading sessions, and that this was simply how things were now. Karen had quietly arranged for the back row to have a somewhat more comfortable chair than the others. Not obviously more comfortable, just marginally better in the way of a man who notices things and does not make them into occasions. I did not thank him for this. We understood each other. Lyra, for her part, seemed to take my attendance as neither surprising nor requiring comment. She read. I listened. Gray slept. The wildflowers bloomed across the lake meadow and the summer went on, and I told myself everything I told myself, and none of it was quite accurate. The fourth summer was the summer I understood that I was in trouble. She had brought a new set of texts, histories from the Northern Territories I had not heard before, kept in a script that had fallen out of common use, and that she had apparently taught herself in order to read them. This was so entirely in keeping with what I had come to know about her, the patient, steady way she went toward things she did not yet know and learned them without announcement, that I found myself watching her face more than listening to the words. She read 3 paragraphs. Then she looked up and said, without particular surprise, "You are not listening." The pack looked at me. "I am," I said. "You are watching," she said, with the precision of someone making a distinction they consider important. "That is different." The midwife made a sound. It may have been a cough. Lyra looked back at her book. "I will start the paragraph again," she said, and did. Gray, at her feet, did not open his eyes, but something in his ears moved in the way that means satisfaction. I spent the rest of the fourth summer listening more carefully and watching somewhat less obviously, and at the end of the 10 days, when she packed her satchels and said goodbye to the pack with the warmth she gave to everything, I stood in the doorway of the hold and told myself that the 5th summer I would understand what I was doing, and I would have a plan, and I would not simply sit in the back row again. The 5th summer came. I sat in the back row. But something was different in the 5th summer, and I knew it the moment she arrived. Not different in her. Lyra was precisely as she always was, unhurried and warm with her pack and her 2 satchels and her introduction. Different in Gray. He came to the door himself to greet her, which he had never done before, not moving to follow her, but actually coming to the hold's entrance, to the point where the threshold is crossed, and standing there when she walked in. She looked at him, he looked at her. She said, "Hello, old wolf." He turned and led her to the long hall with the tall windows, as if he had been waiting to perform this particular task for some time, and was glad to finally have the occasion. I watched this from the top of the corridor stairs, and felt something move in me that I had been not feeling for 4 summers with considerable effort. That evening at dinner I said to Karen, "How long has Gray been meeting her at the door?" Karen passed the bread without looking up. "He came to the entrance corridor the 2nd summer, my lord, but this is the first time he has gone all the way to the threshold." I put down my fork. Said Karen. "You might have mentioned this," I said. I was under the impression, Karen said, still not looking up, that you were aware. I was not aware, I said. I see, he said, with a mildness that communicated everything he was not saying. Would you like me to begin informing you of relevant wolf behavior in future, my lord? Yes, I said, I would. He nodded. The wildflower pollen counts have also been notable this year, he said. I will have a full report prepared. I looked at him, he looked at his dinner. I did not pursue it. The fifth summer's reading sessions began on the second day, as they always did, and I sat in the back row, as I always did, and Lyra read from the new text she had brought, and Gray slept at her feet with the contentment of a creature whose arrangements are exactly as they should be. But on the third day, something shifted. She read a passage from the Northern Chronicle, a description of a pack hold during the long winter festival, the fires lit, the songs, the particular quality of a community that has made it through a hard season together. And she paused at the end of a sentence and looked up, not at the room but at the window, at the summer lake meadow beyond it, with the expression of someone who has just thought of something and is holding it for a moment before deciding what to do with it. Then she looked at Gray. Then, for the first time in 5 summers, she looked directly at me and did not immediately look away. I held very still. She said to the room in general, I think tomorrow I will read something different. The midwife looked up from her knitting. One of the children said, What? With the directness of someone who has not yet learned to disguise curiosity. Something new, Lyra said. She looked at the window again, then at her book, and then she turned the page and continued reading where she had left off, and I spent the rest of the session trying to understand what her expression had meant when she looked at the lake meadow. Gray at her feet had not slept during that exchange. He had been awake, ears up, watching her. I noted this time I thought about it. The next morning, I walked to the lake before the reading session. I do this sometimes. The lake meadow in early morning has a quality of quiet I find useful for thinking, the kind of quiet that has texture, that is full of bird sounds and the movement of the willows and the particular smell of water warming in the early sun. I was not surprised, exactly, to find that Gray had preceded me. He was standing at the water's edge, looking at the far bank. I came to stand beside him. He did not move. What do you know that I don't? I said. He looked at me sidelong, then he looked back at the water. This is, I understand, not a productive method of asking a wolf for information. But Gray and I have had 11 years of understanding each other through something that is not precisely language, and what I received from him in that moment beside the lake was not a verbal answer but something clearer, the particular quality of patience that has reached its natural end and is ready for the next thing. He had been patient for 4 summers. He was done being patient. I stood beside him at the lake's edge and looked at the willows across the water and thought, very clearly, for the first time. I have been in love with Lyra since the first afternoon she came to read, and Gray knew it before I finished the thought, and he has been waiting for me to arrive at it on my own because that is the only way these things work. Then I went back to the hold and sat in my chair in my study and held this understanding for a while, the way you hold something new and breakable before you decide where to put it down. Gray came in. He lay down at the foot of the chair. I know, I said to him. He closed his eyes. The reading session that afternoon was like the others, except that it was not like the others at all. Lyra read. I listened, but the quality of my listening was different, not the careful management of attention I had maintained for 4 summers, watching without watching, knowing without knowing. This was clear-eyed and direct, the way I looked at things I had decided to understand. She was reading a merchant troop chronicle from the lowland territories, dry material, the kind of thing that would put most listeners to sleep, but she made it interesting the way she made everything interesting, by finding the person inside it. The merchant who had written the chronicle had a particular way of noting when a trade had gone well, counted fair, and both parties satisfied. She had noticed this phrase and she mentioned it briefly in the pause between two paragraphs. He always wrote that, she said. Counted fair. It was the thing that mattered to him. And the midwife nodded, and one of the elderly wolves in the front row said, "My father used to say that," and the room had a moment of the particular warmth that comes when a very old, very small thing turns out to have been kept somewhere, in someone's memory, all along. I watched her face during this exchange. The way the warmth moved across it, not performed, just there, the way sunlight is there when the cloud moves. The way she received what the old wolf said without rushing to fill the silence after it. Gray slept. I did not. At the end of the session, when the pack had filtered out and the long hall had emptied to the late afternoon light on the lake, I stayed in my chair in the back row. Lyra was gathering her books. She was not hurrying, she rarely hurried. I said, "You mentioned you would read something different tomorrow." She looked up from the satchel she was packing. "Yes." "What will it be?" She considered this for a moment, the particular considering pause of someone deciding how much to say. Then she said, "Something I wrote." I looked at her. "It is the first time I have written something of my own," she said, with the honesty of a person making an admission that is neither embarrassed nor made large. "I have been reading other people's things for a long time. I thought I should try to say one thing that is mine." I said, "What is it about?" She looked at the window, at the lake, the willows, the late light, then at me. "You'll hear it tomorrow," she said, and shouldered the satchel and left. Gray lifted his head, watched her go, then looked at me with an expression that on a human face would have been called exasperated fondness. "I know," I said again. He lay his head back down. I did not sleep well that night. Not with anxiety, more with the particular quality of restlessness that comes when something has been building for a long time and is reaching its moment, and the approach of the moment has its own energy, its own weight. I got up before dawn and walked the lake meadow again, in the dark and then in the gray of early light, with the willows silver and the water black and still, and the wildflowers closed against the night. Gray walked with me, not at my heel, but beside me, which he does when he considers the occasion to be equal. I thought about 5 summers. I thought about the first afternoon and the sound of her voice from the corridor and the way Gray had turned toward the door. I thought about the 4th summer and her comment that I was watching, not listening, which was precisely accurate and which I had spent a year remembering. I thought about the merchant who had written, counted fair, and both parties satisfied in every ledger, and the way she had noticed that about him. I thought, I have been in this hold for 11 years, and nothing in it has felt the way it feels when she is here. The sun came up over the lake and the wildflowers opened and Gray sat down in the clover and put his nose up, reading the morning the way he always does, and I made the decision I had been moving toward for 5 summers. I was going to stop sitting in the back row, and I was going to say something, and what exactly I said would depend on what she read, but I was going to say it. Gray looked at me over his shoulder, then he walked back toward the hold. I followed. The last reading session of the 5th summer. The room was fuller than usual. The pack had somehow understood, the wordless understanding that moves through a wolf community the way weather moves, before anyone has said the weather is coming, that something was different about today. The midwife was there. The garrison captains, the head cook, 3 of the 4 junior archivists who had never attended a single reading before in any summer I could recall. Even Karen, who generally managed his interest in cultural events by receiving brief summaries afterward, was sitting in a chair along the wall with an expression of administrative neutrality so perfect it was almost artistic. The back row chair, the one that was marginally more comfortable than the others, was empty. I sat in it. Lyra came in with her one satchel. She had left the second behind today, only the one she needed. She arranged herself in the reading chair with the unhurried competence she brought to everything, and she set the satchel at her feet and Gray came and lay down beside the satchel, and she looked at the room. Then she looked at me. I looked back. She opened the satchel and took out a small sheaf of papers, not bound, not a book, just pages she had written herself, the edges uneven the way handwritten pages are when you have not thought about the edges because you were thinking about the words. She settled them in her hands. "This is something I wrote," she said to the room. "I have been reading other people's things for a long time. I thought it was time to say one thing that was mine." The midwife set down her knitting. Lyra began to read. I will not tell you everything she read. Some of it is not mine to put into words. It belongs to the story she made, and to the people who were in that room, and to the morning light coming through the tall windows. But I will tell you the shape of it. It was a love story, not a grand one, not the kind with battles and proclamations and the whole world arranged to witness its significance. A small one, a story about two people who had been in the same room many times, and one of them had been saying something, and the other had been not quite hearing it, and the question at the center of it was what happens when the not quite hearing finally stops. She wrote it with the same quality she brought to the old chronicles, finding the person inside it, not performing emotion, just showing you where it was, the way you show someone where a thing is by looking at it. The pack was entirely still. Gray was not sleeping. He was lying at her feet with his chin on his paws and his eyes open, watching her face as she read, in a way I had never seen him watch anything. She read for perhaps 20 minutes, then she reached the last page. She paused before the last line, a longer pause than usual, not the pause of uncertainty, but the pause of someone who has reached the place they have been moving toward and wants to arrive at it correctly. Then she looked up from the page. Not at the room, at me. She read the last line directly to me. I will not tell you the last line either. I will tell you only that it was the exact true thing, the kind of sentence that, when you hear it, you recognize as having been true for a long time before it was said, and you do not understand why you spent so long not saying it. Gray lifted his head. And then he did something I had never heard him do in 11 years. He howled, once, softly, not the territorial howl, not the alarm howl, not the grief howl, a sound I had no name for, low and sustained, more like a note than a sound, the kind of thing that resonates in your chest before you have time to understand it. The room was very still. Lyra looked at Gray. Gray looked at me. I stood up from the back row chair. I walked to the front of the room. Not slowly, not with ceremony, just directly, the way you move when you have decided to stop not moving. The pack sat in their chairs and watched in the particular silence of people who have understood something just ahead of being told it. I stopped in front of her chair. She was still holding the papers, her story, the last page in her hands. She looked up at me with the level gaze she had been giving me for 5 summers, and this time I finally knew what it was. Not assessment, not patience, not the general attentiveness she gave to everything. It was the particular look of someone who has been hoping, quietly, without announcement, for a long time. "The last line," I said, "read it to me again." She looked at me for a moment, then she looked at the page. She read it again. And the bond mark, which I had carried on my wrist since my wolf nature matured, old silver, the fated mate mark of every alpha king of the Veldrath line, which was supposed to ignite gold when it found its mate, went from silver to living gold so quickly that the light of it moved across the floor before I had finished hearing her voice. She looked at her own wrist. The same gold, the same light, running from where her fingers held the page up to where her sleeve began, unmistakable, undeniable, the particular intelligence of a mark that has been waiting for exactly this and knows, down to the bone, that this is it. She looked at the marks, then at Gray, then at me. "He knew," she said, "not a question." "From the first afternoon," I said. He came to the long hall before you had opened a book. She considered this. And you, she said. I took somewhat longer, I said. 5 summers, she said. Yes, I said. A pause, something moved in her expression, not quite amusement, but its first cousin. And what changed, she said, this summer specifically? You wrote something that was yours, I said. And I understood that I had been sitting in the back row for 4 years waiting to hear what you would say when you finally did. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the honesty that was simply her nature, I wrote it for you to hear. Gray made a sound, not a howl, something smaller, the wolf sound that means satisfaction confirmed. The midwife in the back row made no pretense of being unaffected. Several other pack members were in a similar state. Karen's expression of administrative neutrality had developed a visible crack. I reached out and took both her hands, the papers still in them, her story, the last line still legible, and the gold flared brighter on our wrists and then settled into the warm, steady light of something that has arrived where it was always going. I said because it was the true thing and she deserved the true thing said directly, Lyra, will you stay? Not at Veldrath Hold, not as Luna. Those things would follow, and she and I would talk through all of them with the care they deserved, and I would not rush her toward any of it. I meant something simpler. Will you stay here in this room with me when the 10 days are done, and not pack the 2 satchels and go? She looked at me for the long, considering moment of a person who has been hoping for something, and is now making sure the hoping was accurate. Then she said, I brought more stories than I read. I always bring more than I can finish in 10 days. Then stay, I said, and read them. She looked at Gray. Gray looked at her with the expression of a wolf who has been waiting 5 summers for someone to arrive at the obvious answer and is privately very pleased. All right, she said. I should tell you what happened with the pack, because that is the part of these stories that people want to hear, the moment when the claiming is public and the witnesses see it. Lyra and I walked back to the front of the long hall. She still had her papers. I was still holding her hand. The gold marks were still visible on both our wrists in the afternoon light from the tall windows, and I turned to face the assembled pack of Veldrath. They were watching. Of course they were watching. They had been watching for 5 summers, many of them, in the particular patient way that pack members watch an inevitability build toward its resolution. I said, this is Lyra. She is my fated mate. The bond mark has confirmed it, as you see. She will remain at Veldrath and be its Luna. I did not add anything about councils or titles or ceremonies. Those things would happen in their proper time, with the proper forms. What mattered in this moment was the truth, said plainly, in front of the people who had heard her read for 5 summers and already knew her worth without needing to be told by me. The midwife stood first, then the garrison captains, then the children with the unself-conscious energy of children who feel something important has happened and want to participate in it. Then the whole room, until everyone was standing, and the tall windows were full of the summer afternoon, and Lyra was standing beside me with her papers still in her hand and the gold mark at her wrist, looking at the pack with the expression she had always given to things that moved her. Present, warm, not making it small by performing it. Gray sat down in the center of the room and looked at me with an expression that I can only call told you so, except that he is a wolf and wolves do not say told you so. But they think it, I am certain of this now. There are things that followed, in the weeks and then the seasons after. The formal bonding ceremony, which Lyra approached with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything, and which she made considerably more personal than the traditional form, by insisting on including, as part of the reading of the vows, a passage from one of the old chronicles she particularly loved. My counsel, who had been suggesting for some years that I needed a Luna and had been receiving polite non-engagement, received the news with the particular reaction of people who have wanted something to happen and are delighted by it while also being slightly embarrassed that it happened in such an entirely unpredictable way. One of the junior counselors asked carefully what Lyra's family line was, and I told him she was an itinerant story reader of no formal pack affiliation, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "And the bond mark confirmed?" And I said yes, and he said, "Well," and that was the end of that conversation. Karen had the back row chair in the long hall moved to the front. He did not explain why. It became the chair Lyra sat in when she read. Gray continued to lie at its feet. She continued to read to the pack. Not just in the summer, through the whole year, twice a week, in the long hall with the tall windows. She had more stories than anyone had fully understood, stored in the 2 leather satchels and in her head, which held considerably more than the satchels. Over the autumn, she began teaching the pack members who wanted to learn to read for themselves, not as a formal program, just as the natural extension of someone who had spent her life in the company of stories, and saw no reason to keep them from anyone who wanted them. She wrote more things of her own. She did not always share them with the room, some she kept in a smaller notebook that she carried separately from the others. Once I asked her what was in it, and she said, "Things I'm still deciding about," and I said, "Are you deciding about them for anyone's benefit in particular?" And she looked at me with the precise, level look and said, "Perhaps." I did not push. She would tell me when she was ready, and she was always, eventually, ready. Gray, who had attended every reading session for 5 years on the grounds that his alpha would need the information eventually, retired from his role as the longest-serving and least acknowledged matchmaker in the territory of Veldrath with great dignity and without apparent comment. He continued to lie at the foot of the reading chair, but now that the situation had resolved itself to his satisfaction, he slept more deeply and more peacefully than before. This is, I have come to believe, what 5 years of patient waiting looks like when it is finally over. In the 3rd winter after Lyra came to stay, I came to the long hall one morning early, not for any particular reason, just the habit of moving through the hold in the early hours when it is quiet and mine, and I found her already there. She was not reading. She was sitting in the chair with the smaller notebook open on her knee, writing something by the winter light from the tall windows, which showed the lake frozen and the meadow under snow and the willows bare. She was writing with the focused, unhurried quality she brought to everything, the quality I had first noticed from a corridor 5.5 years ago, before I knew whose voice it was. I stood in the doorway and watched. Gray was at her feet asleep. Not the alert doze of his years at my side, full sleep, deep and steady, entirely at ease. After a moment she looked up and saw me in the doorway. "Come in," she said, "I'm almost done." I came in. I sat in the chair that had been moved to the front row beside hers. I waited. She wrote 3 more sentences, then she closed the notebook. "What were you writing?" I said. She thought about this for a moment, then she held out the notebook. I opened it to the last page and read what she had written. It was about this, about the long hall and the winter light and the frozen lake and the sleeping wolf, about a man who had sat in the back row for 4 summers and had thought, incorrectly, that nobody noticed. About the 5th summer and the last line, and the gold that had run across the floor before she finished speaking. She had written it in the present tense, as if it were happening now, as if the moment were still open. The last sentence was, "And he came through the doorway and the wolf slept on, and I wrote that he was here." I looked at her. She looked back with the level gaze that I now knew, with the bone certainty of 11 years with Gray and 5 summers of not quite understanding, followed by 1 summer of finally understanding, to be love. Direct, present, entirely itself, not performing anything. "Counted fair," I said. "And both parties satisfied." She smiled, the full, unguarded smile that she did not often show, because she did not perform warmth, but when it came, it was entirely real. "Yes," she said, "something like that." Gray slept on. The winter light moved across the hall. The frozen lake held the sky. And the story, which had been building for 5 summers and one last line and a wolf who knew from the first afternoon, was the story we were living now, ordinary and extraordinary at once, the way all the best stories are.